The ribeye cooled slowly on the plate in front of me. Medium rare, just how I liked it. Just how she used to order it for me before she started calling me predictable. A table for 7. 7 polished glasses. 7 folded napkins. 7 places set with care at my favorite steakhouse, tucked in the back near the fireplace, the same one we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries at for over 2 decades. And not a single damn chair was occupied. Not by my wife, who texted that morning saying she had a crushing migraine, might have to lie down for the rest of the day. Not by my daughter, who responded, sorry dad. Last minute thing came up with Jessica, love you though. Not by my son, who never replied. My brother left me on read. My best friend, 30 years of shared cigars and road trips, sent nothing but radio silence. You know what no one tells you about turning 59? That the loudest thing at your birthday dinner might be the absence of people who used to swear they'd always have your back. They didn't just flake. They coordinated. I wasn't dining alone by accident. And yet, I didn't flinch. Not once. You see, I'd known. For months. About the affair. About the siphoned funds. About the family group chat where I was the punchline. I didn't say a word. I let it all happen. Watched them stack their cards, while I quietly reshuffled the entire deck. Because you don't confront betrayal by shouting. You confront it by planning. Right around the time my steak reached room temperature, the waiter came over with a note. No envelope, just folded, stiff stock. He held it like it was cursed. Someone asked me to give you this, sir. I opened it. 3 words, written in a jagged hand I recognized immediately. Check your phone. It was all it said. No signature. No flourish. But I knew exactly who sent it. So I took a breath, sipped my wine, and picked up my phone. The screen lit up with one message. One name. Her father. A retired corporate litigator. The same man who once told me during a fishing trip, "You're the only reason this family isn't a tabloid scandal." He never defended me in public, but I knew he watched. And now he was scared. I just got the alert from the trust law firm. The message read, "Call me before you destroy this entire family." So, they'd gotten it. The formal trigger notification. It had begun. Funny thing about family dinners, you spend decades assuming they're about connection. Turns out, sometimes they're just performance art. And when the cast walks off stage without you, they forget you might own the rights to the entire script. I didn't respond to the message. Just turned the phone face down on the linen. I know most people just listen to these stories without ever subscribing, but if even a few of you do, it tells the team someone out there actually sees what we're doing. And trust me, that means a hell of a lot more than you think. The table stayed empty. The steak got cold. The waiter came by twice, hesitated, then walked away. He wanted to ask if I was okay. I wanted to ask if betrayal ever stopped stinging after the 10th or 11th time. But instead, I just leaned back, folded the note, and slipped it into my blazer pocket, right next to the copy of Clause 14C from the Hawley Family Trust Charter. The one that had been dormant since 1954. The one they all forgot existed. The one I had quietly reactivated 37 hours ago. Let them enjoy their little whispers, their smug looks, their private messages thinking I was too old, too tired, too slow to notice. Because I didn't just notice. I documented. And now, the dinner was over. The reckoning was just beginning. Buzz. The message hovered on the lock screen like a gun cocking in the distance. One line. No emojis. No pleasantries. I just got the alert from the trust law firm. Call me before you destroy this entire family. The tone was all wrong. No, hi, Thomas. No, let's talk this through. Just panic. Raw, stripped, and clumsy from a man who once argued multi-million-dollar mergers with a voice like polished granite. Thomas didn't move. Just stared at the glowing words, then tapped the screen dark and set the phone face down beside his wine glass. It was done. The notice had been delivered, which meant Ms. Drake at the trust firm had initiated phase 2 of the displacement, which meant every name on the secondary beneficiary tier, including his wife, his children, his brother, and yes, even his lifelong best friend, had just received a digital notification informing them of pending trust action due to coordinated misconduct against the primary beneficiary. That was the phrase Ms. Drake insisted on using, coordinated misconduct. It sounded like something from a corporate HR handbook, but it would feel more like an earthquake in their little world of collusion. Her father wasn't part of the betrayal, not directly. But Thomas hadn't forgotten the summer of 2019, when he quietly watched the old man intercept a suspicious tax document that had accidentally arrived at the family lake house. A document that would have tipped Thomas off to his wife's side account, funneling $3,000 a week into consulting retainers that didn't exist. The old man didn't say a word, just folded the paper, tossed it in the fire, and poured another glass of scotch. "You're better off not knowing, Thomas," he'd muttered. "Some things you just let slide." Thomas had nodded, even then, not because he agreed, but because he was filing the memory in that deep vault he reserved for long games. Now, the vault was open. The text from her father wasn't just a warning. It was a confession, a belated admission that everything they thought was protected wasn't. Thomas had combed through the charter himself, with Ms. Drake's guidance. Every clause, every footnote, every little moral relic his Depression-era grandfather had thought to codify when building the Hawley family trust. Clause 14C. That was the linchpin, hidden behind archaic language and assumed to be unenforceable. It stated, with dry precision, if the trust's primary beneficiary shall endure orchestrated familial breach, with evidenced concealment, said party may elect displacement of secondary tiers upon third-party review. It took 9 months to gather the evidence, 6 weeks to assemble the review, 3 days for the firm's ethics board to sign off. Now, the emails were sent, the accounts frozen, the legal noose tightening, and her father, stoic, cruelly pragmatic her whole life, was finally panicking. He wasn't calling because he cared. He was calling because the beast he'd once thought docile had finally bared its teeth. Thomas took a slow sip of his wine. Still hadn't touched the steak. He watched the dining room. Soft light. Chatter. Forks clinking. No one noticed the man in the corner who had just detonated a legacy. Her father's message was followed by a second. "I warned her not to involve your brother. That was a mistake." Thomas let that one sit too. A third. "Please, let's meet. I'll come to you." Thomas smiled, just barely. The man who once joked that Thomas was a good beta to her alpha now wanted an audience. And for what? To bargain with decades of complicity? Thomas swiped up, copied the message, and forwarded it to Ms. Drake with a single instruction. Log under secondary party panic response. The trust required documentation of attempted interference once trigger protocols were in effect. He wasn't ignoring the old man. He was filing him, alongside the rest. Let them squirm. Let them threaten. Let them posture. He wasn't erasing the family. He was recentering it. Around truth. Around legacy. And around the one person they all underestimated. The man who sat quietly at the head of the empty table and let their silence indict them. The Hawley family trust had always been whispered about in cautious tones, like a ghost everyone pretended was just folklore. The old man's Bible, they used to call it. Pages of dense, typewritten legalisms buried in mahogany filing cabinets and locked drawers. Established in 1946, restructured twice in the 70s, and then digitally archived in 2003 after a brief scare with mold damage. Thomas knew it better than any of them, not because he had to, but because while they were laughing at his loyal golden retriever demeanor behind his back, he was reading, and memorizing, and preparing. His grandfather, Everett Hawley, wasn't just a shrewd investor. He was a paranoid one. After watching 2 of his own brothers destroy a family shipping business during the Great Depression by lying, stealing, and infighting, he'd sworn that no future Hawley would be allowed to burn the house down without the matches turning on them. So he created the trust, not as a gift, but as a minefield. You could walk it. You could benefit from it. But if you misstepped, even once, it would go off. Clause 14C was one of the tripwires. Most of the family assumed it was just symbolic. A gesture. Something written in a bygone era when Betrayal still wore suits and ties and not Instagram DMs and encrypted group chats. But Clause 14C was real, and it was active. Thomas had reread it hundreds of times over the last year. Should the primary beneficiary suffer coordinated harm from kin, said beneficiary may activate discretionary displacement, pending corroborative evidence and review by the governing ethics panel. The phrasing sounded ceremonial, until you realized what it meant. It meant if you were betrayed, and you could prove it, financially, relationally, legally, you could reset the board, displace everyone, remove voting rights, suspend inheritances, freeze properties, cancel stipends, even revoke access to family resources under fiduciary claim. The only requirement? That it be coordinated. And they had made that so easy. The photos of his wife and his best friend in the back seat of a black SUV leaving a conference in Chicago. His brother's signature on the LLC documents tied to a dummy consulting company his wife used to drain $180,000 from a shared investment account. His kids' shared Airbnb bookings, scheduled to align with her wellness retreats, paid through accounts tagged as mental health disbursements. He had hired no private investigator. Didn't need to. They were lazy. entitled, and careless. Every invoice, every email, every financial move, screen captured, notarized, organized by Ms. Drake's legal team with disturbing efficiency. And at 7:46 that morning, Thomas authorized submission. Not a declaration, not a confrontation, just a quiet checkbox on a digital form marked Proceed with Displacement. By 9:15, official notices had gone out. The software sent each recipient a formal trust notification. You are receiving this notice due to a pending fiduciary review regarding your status as a secondary beneficiary. A hold has been placed on all distributions pending further determination. No details, no warning, just cold, clean precision. The same people who had ignored his birthday text now received something far more chilling. And by noon, two of them, his son and brother, had already tried calling him. He let it ring. Because the Holly Trust wasn't his revenge. It was his shield. It was what his grandfather had built for a future Holly who might be surrounded by smiling traitors and didn't know who to trust. And now, it was doing exactly what it was designed for. To protect the legacy, not the noise, not the appearances, not the ones who performed family while poisoning it from within. No, just the one who stayed silent long enough to let them finish burying themselves, then calmly turned on the spotlight. Clause 14C had slept for decades. Now it was awake, and it didn't blink. 3 days before the dinner, before the silent chairs and the trembling voicemail, Thomas sat beneath the recessed lights of an office that smelled like lavender disinfectant and old hardwood. Across from him sat Ms. Elaine Drake, senior trust administrator at Carrington & Steele, one of the most discreet legacy firms in the state. She was small, silver-haired, and wore glasses so narrow they looked like punctuation marks balanced on her nose. Her voice was even, almost soothing, as if she were reading bedtime stories, not triggering financial exile. Laid out between them on the table, a navy leather portfolio, its brass corner clips still cold from the morning air. Inside, page after page of damning detail. Bank transfers that shouldn't exist. Security footage from the Vermont cabin, clearly showing his wife entering with his brother, hours after they claimed to be at separate conferences. A notarized witness statement from a family office employee who overheard Thomas's daughter mocking his gullibility on a call with her mother. The witness had even transcribed the laughter. He's still trying to plan a surprise birthday like some sad puppy, she'd said. It's pathetic. Ms. Drake turned a page and rotated it slightly for him to view. Reallocation of joint property equity from shared to sole ownership, executed by your wife last month, she noted, tapping the page. Filed with incomplete spousal disclosure. That's your signature, yes? It wasn't. It was a rushed scrawl. The T didn't even curve properly. Likely copied from an old lease agreement. Thomas shook his head. Ms. Drake nodded, as if that was expected, then adjusted her tablet and brought up a digital dashboard showing all 7 named secondary beneficiaries. In the view of the Ethics Committee, based on documented evidence and review, all 7 parties have breached their fiduciary or moral obligations. Would you like to initiate full displacement? Thomas didn't speak for several seconds, not because he was hesitant, but because he wanted to feel it. This moment. Not anger, not triumph, just the sterile gravity of a door closing. He nodded once. Yes, full displacement. Ms. Drake didn't flinch. She tapped her screen. A small chime sounded. The next board cycle will reflect these changes. She outlined them one by one, like a surgeon explaining a routine extraction. The family's 14% ownership stake in Hollymore Logistics would be reweighted, with Thomas assuming 100% of the trust shares. His brother, formerly listed as a proxy, was removed. A Cape Cod property, currently occupied by his son and his girlfriend, was to be frozen immediately under asset review. Occupancy rights suspended. The European travel stipends, formerly distributed to the daughter and her art collective partner, were terminated. Reimbursement for prior travel exceeding budget was now retroactively disputed. A private education fund, originally intended for future grandchildren, was placed under restricted lock status. Use now required unanimous board approval, which no longer existed. Ms. Drake recited these changes the way a librarian might announce overdue fees. No venom, no joy, just procedural fluency. Thomas didn't react, just listened, breathing slowly. She paused, then folded her hands. Mr. Hawley, I'm required to ask if you would like us to offer the displaced parties an explanatory review meeting. He glanced up. To what end? Closure. Or perhaps reconciliation. He almost laughed. But instead, He shook his head. They didn't offer me any when they decided to write me out of my own family. Ms. Drake made a small note. Very well. Review offer declined. Documentation noted. She reached into a drawer and slid across a sealed envelope. These are your formal trustee reassignment documents. They'll be countersigned and filed with the Secretary of State by morning. You'll be the sole active beneficiary until a new secondary list is established. He stared at the envelope, not with hesitation, but with the solemnity of a man taking a folded flag at a military funeral. He hadn't wanted this, but they earned it. Every fake excuse, every whispered smirk, every empty chair. This wasn't a tantrum. This was architecture. Because Thomas knew something they'd all forgotten. Legacy isn't built in public. It's defended in silence. And now, piece by piece, he was reclaiming it. Without yelling, without slamming doors. Just one quiet signature at a time. The irony was that his brother, Patrick, always fancied himself the guardian of the family legacy. That's what he called himself at the last board retreat, after too much whiskey and a speech that no one asked for. We're the stewards of Granddad's vision, he'd said, half slurring, full of smug. And Thomas, well, you've always been the heart. But I'm the spine. Thomas remembered forcing a polite smile. Spine. Right. The same spine that bent like a paperclip the second their sister-in-law flirted with a real estate developer in Naples. The same spine that twisted conveniently when their father passed, and the estate was quietly carved up behind closed doors. And now, the same spine that helped Thomas's wife shift property titles under the table in exchange for consulting credit. But the thing about Patrick was that he never read anything. Not really. He signed. He nodded. He bluffed his way through board meetings with phrases like quarterly leverage delta and legacy liquidity. But he never, ever, read the fine print. Thomas did. And Clause 10A was buried deep in the trust charter, written in a post-war clause structure so archaic it might as well have been Latin. But the meaning was simple. If a sibling co-trustee is found to have knowingly acted in coordination with external parties to obscure, redirect, or otherwise compromise shared assets, the primary beneficiary may revoke said trustee's voting rights by submitting evidence to the governance administrator and notifying the Secretary of State. The language wasn't flowery. It didn't beg for drama. It required one form, and a notarized statement, which Thomas submitted 2 days after his meeting with Ms. Drake. He didn't call Patrick, didn't threaten him, didn't ask why he decided to help Thomas's wife forge his initials on the Vermont land refinance document. He already knew why. Patrick had always resented being the younger one, the one who didn't inherit the controlling share, the one who had to ask for approval on every capital disbursement. But instead of building something of his own, he clung to Thomas's orbit, pretending to protect what he was secretly looting. And so, by Wednesday morning, a digital file landed in the inboxes of the board of Hollymore Logistics. Change of trustee authority. Thomas Hawley, sole voting rights, effective immediately. Attached was the state filing. Clean. Verified. Stamped. The system had accepted the submission without question because it was airtight. There was no dramatic expulsion. No press release. Just a silent deletion. Patrick texted him at 11:43 a.m. Hey, did you change something on the board app? I'm not seeing the vote menu. Thomas replied simply, you're no longer a voting trustee. See Clause 10A. There was no response for 3 minutes. Then, wait, what the hell are you doing? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he forwarded the exchange to Ms. Drake for logging and walked into his study, where the original trust charter still sat on a walnut bookshelf, bound in green leather, the edges gold-leafed like a church Bible. He pulled it down and flipped straight to 10A. Fingered the margin where his grandfather had scrawled a pencil note decades ago. No one is immune, not even blood. He hadn't understood it as a boy. Now it was a scalpel. When Patrick finally called, sputtering, raging, trying to sound shocked, it went straight to voicemail. Thomas had already created a new internal protocol at the logistics firm. All board communication to go through legal, no exceptions. That night, Thomas sat by the fireplace with a tumbler of rye and watched the fire crackle. His brother hadn't just betrayed him. He'd tested him. And failed. No outburst. No fight. Just a quiet filing, logged at the Secretary of State's office at 2:14 p.m. A signature. A submission. And then silence. Because authority doesn't scream. It signs. They called him Dad when the checks cleared, but him when the group chat turned toxic. He knew it. He'd scrolled through screenshots forwarded from an intern at his daughter's old startup. the one he'd funded to the tune of $250,000 under the promise of a sustainable jewelry line that turned into exactly one pop-up event and 6 months of Instagram storytelling. The intern had quit after 2 weeks and emailed Thomas the archive out of guilt. "You deserve to know," she wrote. He hadn't replied. He just saved it. "Let him sit alone like the martyr he loves to be," his son had written. "It's not our job to protect his ego," his daughter had chimed in. "He wants us to grovel so he can feel powerful. Screw that. He's not the only Holly who matters." They thought it was harmless venting, just private frustration. But what they didn't know, what none of them ever bothered to learn, was that the trust wasn't just a financial pipeline. It was a fortress, and it had rules. Clause 22D was buried under the disbursement conditions header, 2 pages after a clause about healthcare compliance, and just before the clause on charitable overrides. Dry, forgettable language. Deliberate alienation or abandonment of the primary beneficiary during periods of documented emotional duress shall result in immediate deferment of all pending or scheduled disbursements to involved secondary parties. Duration of deferment shall be undefined until reassessment. Simple translation: if you abandon your father when he needs you, no inheritance, no schedule, no appeals. And now, on the Monday following the dinner, they got the notice. Both of them. Individually addressed emails sent from the law firm's secure server. Subject: change in disbursement status, Holly Family Trust. Dear, first name, this is to inform you that based on a recent ethics panel review, your standing as a secondary beneficiary under the Holly Family Trust has been reclassified as under temporary deferment. This action was taken under Clause 22D due to behavior inconsistent with beneficiary obligations. All future inheritance draws are suspended pending full reassessment. No apology, no warmth, just bone-cold legal air. His daughter didn't wait. She called within minutes, voicemail, screaming, "You're doing this because I didn't show up to your stupid dinner? Because I didn't want to pretend everything was fine." She didn't mention the burner Venmo account she used to send their mother money while pretending to be financially overwhelmed. She didn't mention the group vacation she planned with her mother and uncle, Patrick, under the label wellness retreat. She only mentioned the money. His son didn't scream. He texted, "We can fix this. I'll talk to her. We'll all talk to you. Let's just not do anything permanent." Permanent? The only permanent thing was the fracture. It wasn't that they'd made a mistake. It was that they'd chosen to believe the worst version of him. The narrative his wife spun while massaging her own guilt into victimhood. "She's hurting too," his son once said. Maybe. But she didn't hurt when she drained the emergency savings account and shifted the Roth IRA beneficiary name to her new LLC. She didn't hurt when she stood in front of the mirror rehearsing how to gaslight their children into thinking Thomas was manipulative and needy. That, too, had been in the intern screenshots. The truth was, the children were grown. And like grown adults, they made decisions. Now they would live with them. He didn't call back, didn't text, didn't send a warning. He simply let the clause speak for itself. The trust firm logged their reactions, as required. His daughter filed an urgent inquiry with the fund administrator. It was denied. His son emailed the estate attorney, CC'd their mother. No reply. Because the disbursement pause wasn't just policy. It was prophecy. It was written decades ago by a man who'd survived his own family turning on him, who'd sworn his descendants would never feel powerless in the face of betrayal. And now, Thomas understood him better than ever. This wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. Because once you let your children believe love entitles them to inheritance, no matter how they treat you, you hand them a sword and place your own neck beneath it. So Thomas didn't reply. He poured a glass of bourbon, walked outside to the garden he'd planted with his own hands, and let the silence fall like armor. Let them scream. He had nothing left to give them, except the lesson they thought he'd never teach. She was just stepping out of her midday facial when the process server walked up beside her Range Rover and asked her name with the kind of detached politeness that screamed, "This isn't a package." She didn't even get to buckle her seatbelt before the envelope landed on her lap. Not a divorce petition. She might have expected that. No, this was worse. The cover page was dry, but the second she flipped to the second paragraph, her hands began to tremble. Legal challenge to co-signature authority due to fiduciary misrepresentation and concealed financial partnership. In other words, you're being cut out of every account you thought you controlled. Thomas hadn't even bothered with theatrics. No dramatic confrontation. No accusation over dinner. Just a surgical filing served midday on a Friday, when her attorney was already out of office and the courts wouldn't reopen until Monday. Attached to the notice was an evidence timeline, 8 pages long, chronological, meticulous, clinical, and it ended, very deliberately, with one line that turned the entire document into a weapon. April 14th, subject declined invitation to spouse's birthday dinner without notification. Coordinated absence corroborated by 6 additional named parties. Breach indicates intent to cause emotional and reputational harm to primary beneficiary. She read it twice, then a third time, because in that moment, it sank in. The dinner wasn't just some forgotten social obligation. It had been the final domino. The trigger Thomas needed to reframe everything they'd done, not as a sad little family drama, but as coordinated, legally actionable sabotage. That line alone reframed the betrayal as intentional harm. And suddenly, what had once felt like gossip, eye rolls, and a "we just didn't feel like pretending" attitude was now evidence. Evidence reviewed by attorneys, stamped by the trust's ethics panel, filed with a judge. Her attorney, once he finally returned her call later that night, read the document and didn't say a word for a full 10 seconds. Then, just, "Did you know he was documenting all of this?" She whispered no, because she hadn't. None of them had. The timeline referenced everything, from her husband's GPS logs that showed his presence at 3 separate locations where she claimed he hadn't been, to account access attempts made from her devices at hours she swore she was asleep, to shared airdrop metadata showing her in possession of images, photos of her and Thomas's best friend, that she'd sworn never existed. And then came the bomb, a concealed financial partnership filed with the state 3 months ago, an LLC registered in Wyoming, her name on it, alongside Patrick's. She'd forgotten about that one. Patrick said it was just a formality to help with his taxes. She never imagined Thomas would find it, let alone use it. Now it was cited in the filing as clear evidence of concealed partnership, executed without required disclosure to the primary beneficiary. She scrambled, called Patrick, voicemail, tried her daughter. No answer. Texted her son. Did Dad really do this? Nothing. Because by then, they'd all seen it too. And they all knew this wasn't a bluff. Thomas had filed before serving. The law firm had logged the co-signature freeze across 5 banks and 2 brokerages. Her name was flagged. Transactions halted. Her access? Pending review. And the language used in the documents wasn't passive. Words like malicious coordination, intent to defraud, covert withdrawal, and premeditated asset redirection painted her not as a scorned wife, but as a hostile actor, a risk to the trust. Her lawyer tried to pivot. We'll file a response Monday. Say you were under emotional distress. Frame it as a miscommunication. Deny intent. But even as he said it, she could hear the uncertainty. Because you can argue emotion. You can't argue a timeline. Especially not one that ends with 7 empty chairs and a note that says, check your phone. She poured herself a glass of wine. Her hand still shook. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a mirror, held up by the man she thought was too soft to retaliate. Now she could see herself clearly, and the reflection looked a lot like premeditated harm. Documented, submitted, and already accepted by the court. The phone rang at 6:18 a.m., just as the sun was starting to knife through the slats of the old plantation shutters in Thomas's den. He let it buzz 3 times before answering. No greeting, just silence at first. Then the low, gravel-coated voice of the man who used to toast him with bourbon and call him son, like he meant it. You didn't need to go this far. Thomas exhaled once, quiet and steady. You raised her, he said. You knew what she was capable of. You just didn't care until it turned back on you. A pause. The rustle of papers, or maybe just hands trembling on the other end. Her father was the type who never lost his footing. In meetings, in courtrooms, in heated family dinners. He always had that coiled composure, like a wolf pretending to be someone's grandpa. But today, the mask was slipping. They'll be ruined, he said, a little too fast. The board, the foundation, even her consulting licenses. Thomas cut in. Calm. Surgical. They shouldn't have gambled with my silence. That landed. There was a breath, sharp and unsteady, followed by the barely audible click of a lighter. He could almost see the man pacing in his home office, the old leather chair spinning behind him, a folder half open on the desk with red tabs that hadn't been there yesterday. I advised her against freezing the IRA, the old man said. I told her it would trigger scrutiny. Thomas didn't reply. She said you'd never notice, he added, softer this time. That you never asked about money. Thomas chuckled, but without humor. I didn't ask because I already knew. I just wanted to see how far she'd take it before you stepped in. The silence now was heavier. Jesus Christ, Thomas, he muttered. This isn't damage control anymore. You've started a fire. No, Thomas said. I'm just refusing to clean up their ashes anymore. Another pause. You think this won't touch you? Thomas glanced at the framed photo on the shelf, his wedding day. Her father, standing beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other holding a drink. The fake grin. The too tight grip. It already did, Thomas said. That's why it ends here. There was a long pause. A shift in the air. The kind of silence that only comes when a man realizes he no longer has leverage, only legacy to lose. You could have come to me, her father said at last. We could have fixed it privately, quietly. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that offer, soaked in history, in masculine codes of discretion and handling things like men. But then he opened them. I tried quiet. For 20 years, I tried quiet. You all just mistook it for weakness. She's my daughter, Thomas. She's a grown woman, he replied. And now she'll face the grown consequences. You're hurting your own name. The old man tried again, this time reaching for legacy, the last arrow in the quiver. The Holly name has weight. Institutions. Foundations. You don't just burn that down. I'm not burning it down, Thomas said, voice ice cold. I'm burning you out of it. That did it. Her father went silent again, but this time it was the kind of silence Thomas had waited years to hear. Not tactical, not condescending, but small. The sound of a man realizing the chessboard he thought he'd built was now flipped. Thomas waited another beat, then added, and tell Patrick to stop leaving voicemails. I'm not interested in his version of the story either. The old man didn't protest, just quietly muttered, You're not the same man I used to know. No, Thomas said. You never knew me. You just assumed I'd never wake up. He ended the call. No slam. No final word. Just a click. Then Thomas placed the phone back on the desk, stood, and walked to the window. The sun had finally cleared the trees. Light was spilling into the room, painting the shelves, the rug, the old oak desk. He stared at the light for a long while, because now there was no going back, and no one left to call. The email hit inboxes at 8:02 p.m. sharp on Sunday. No leaks, no rumors beforehand. Just one cold, sterile subject line dropped into the inboxes of over 300 stakeholders, donors, corporate partners, and institutional liaisons tied to the Holly Trust. Subject, Holly Trust, formal update on governance changes. No emojis, no branding flares, just a PDF attachment and one paragraph of body text. Please find enclosed a formal summary of governance restructuring and beneficiary status updates as ratified by the Trust's ethics panel and approved by the designated legal entities. These changes are effective immediately. Inside the attachment, 6 pages of reshuffling. Thomas's name now stood alone under primary trustee. His wife, Patrick, both children, and his longtime best friend, formerly listed as strategic advisors and legacy stewards, had been removed. Their positions were marked, vacated due to breach of ethics protocol under Clause 14C and Clause 22D. 2 foundations had their sponsorships paused. 3 grant initiatives were frozen. Travel stipends, consulting retainers, joint investment privileges, all suspended. And the final page named 3 newly appointed oversight roles, a compliance officer, a governance analyst, and a forensic auditor. None of them bore the Holly name. It was a quiet massacre. And by Monday morning, the calls began. Not from family, from institutions. One former board sponsor, head of a university endowment tied to a scholarship in Everett Holly's name, resigned immediately. Another followed within the hour. By noon, whispers circled. What had they done? Why were the names removed? Was there fraud? Infighting? A journalist from a niche philanthropic blog tried calling Thomas's assistant. No comment. By 3:15 p.m., Thomas's personal cell rang. One of the departing board members. A man he'd shaken hands with dozens of times at galas, who once toasted him for being the quiet engine of Holly stability. The man didn't waste time. They're blaming you, he said. Thomas, seated at the long wooden table in the Trust's private conference room, simply looked out the window and replied, Let them. That was it. He didn't raise his voice, didn't issue a rebuttal, didn't log on his social media to clear his name or leak juicy details to counter whatever version they were spinning in whispers and backchannels. He'd spent years keeping their secrets, letting the family brand shine even as it rotted underneath. Also, they could parade around with his grandfather's legacy like it was a personal brand asset. But now it was institutional, not emotional. The betrayal may have started with a dinner, but the response had ended in law, governance, structure. He didn't have to scream. He just let the infrastructure do the talking. That night, his daughter tried to post something vague on her story. A black square. A cryptic quote about family betrayal and corruption of power. It was deleted within hours. Not because Thomas made a call. Because the new governance policy Ms. Drake instituted included a clause. Public commentary from displaced trustees would trigger additional legal review of previous expenditures. His daughter wasn't stupid. She got the message. Patrick tried to leak a sanitized version to a local alumni newsletter. They ignored it. The new oversight team had already reached out to all active partners with a simple FAQ document. All questions would be routed through legal, and unofficial statements were considered non-binding and reputationally unverified. In other words, if you talked, no one was listening. Thomas watched it unfold from a distance, mostly in silence. He made no speeches, no statements, no calls. Because for the first time, the family's betrayal wasn't just emotional wreckage. It was professionally obsolete. They hadn't just lost privileges. They'd lost credibility. And the Holly Trust? It moved forward, unflinching, recalibrated. He had rebuilt it, not for spite, but for preservation. His grandfather hadn't written Clause 14C for tempers. He'd written it for moments like this, when the only way to defend the future was to subtract the past. And now, subtraction was complete. The voicemail came in at 11:39 p.m., long after the governance update had gone out, long after the resignations, and just hours before the first financial freeze would post across 5 personal and joint accounts. Thomas was reading in the den, an old hardback he hadn't touched in years, when the screen lit up. Her name, still listed under favorites, not out of affection, but because some battles are best monitored from the front lines. He let it roll to voicemail. Seconds later, the message popped up with a tiny red dot. He stared at it for a moment, then pressed play. Her voice was nothing like the one that used to throw birthday parties or plan weekend getaways or lie next to him whispering about early retirement in the Keys. Now it trembled, edged with panic, but worse, regret masquerading as concern. "You've taken everything," she began, already half breathless. "They're panicking. The kids don't know what to do. Patrick's threatening some kind of press statement, and my dad, he's threatening lawsuits. It's spiraling, Thomas. Please, just talk to me. Just tell me what you want." She paused there, as if waiting for him to pick up in real time. Then, softer, "You were never supposed to do this. I didn't think you could." Click. End of message. No apology. No admission. Just damage control in a shaking voice. He saved the message, opened his encrypted email channel, and forwarded the voicemail file to Ms. Drake with a simple subject line. Potential interference. Archive under 14C post-trigger activity. No emotion. No note. Just procedure. Then he stood, stretched, and changed into a navy blazer. He didn't have a plan. He wasn't hungry. But some instincts are rituals. He drove across town with the windows down. No music, just the hum of tires and the occasional October breeze. The steakhouse was still open. He pulled into the same lot. Same valet. Same soft jazz floating out the front door. He didn't give a name. Didn't need to. The host recognized him immediately. There was a flash of uncertainty on the young man's face, somewhere between guilt and confusion. He was clearly wondering if he should say something, if he should apologize for last week's uncomfortable scene. Thomas saved him the trouble. "Just a quiet seat," he said. "Same one, if it's free." It was. Within minutes, he was seated again, corner booth, low light, polished cutlery untouched on the linen. He ordered the same meal. Ribeye, medium rare, side of creamed spinach, double bourbon neat. No one else came. Of course not. But this time, it didn't feel like neglect. It felt like clarity. He glanced across the empty seats. One for the daughter who called him controlling. One for the son who called him absent. One for Patrick, the brother who never met a knife he wouldn't twist. One for the best friend who mistook loyalty for leverage. And one for her, the woman who once promised forever, and then spent 2 decades treating his patience like a weakness. 7 chairs again. Only now, the silence wasn't hollow. It was earned. Because this time, there was no wondering. No waiting. The trust had spoken. The legal doors were sealed. And the ones who'd coordinated their betrayal had finally run out of scripts, explanations, and excuses. They hadn't just skipped a dinner. They'd staged a coup. And they lost. He cut into the steak, took a bite, and raised his glass, not in bitterness, not in victory, but in resolution. Because there's a difference between being alone and being at peace. Last week, those empty seats mocked him. Tonight, they honored him. The server came by once, asked softly, "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Thomas glanced up, then smiled. "No," he said. "This is perfect."